before we move on into the decline of Rome and the fragmentation of the empire, I want to make a very important point. And that is that by the time the 3rd century, 4th century of the Common Era, Rome was really the whole world in the West. It was very cosmopolitan. These people were not Italians anymore. They were from everywhere, as we see. The Septimius Severus, who built the large arch monument on the site of the Comitium in the Roman Forum that still stands, was from Libya, as was his son. We have Philip the Arab. Alexander Severus succeeded Caracalla, and he was actually a Syrian. Elagabalus was from Turkey. Aurelian was actually from the Ukraine. Aurelian built the wall that still stands surrounding Rome today in the late 3rd century. Maximinus, Decius, a German, Antoninus, what today we would call French, Trajan and Hadrian, both from Spain, and Aemilianus from Morocco. This is a large and complex world in which your identity as a Roman did not negate your religion. In fact, Elagabalus worshipped only the sun god and built huge temples to him, one on the Palatine actually that was converted into a monastery. But rather, I'm trying to point out two things. One is this ends at the Rhine and the Danube, and it ultimately pushed up against that border were Germanic tribes that would come over by the million in the 5th century. Also to show where Constantine, who was from Rome, was crowned emperor, was actually in Eboracum, today York, in England. To just make this point more firmly, at a place called Arbea, which was a military castrum in northern England, a whole sort of hoard, a cache of inscriptions were discovered. In fact, this is what Harris bases most of his research, not all of it, but some of it on. And I'm struck by some of these inscriptions. People who are writing their names, their identities, their places of origin. So we look at this. The first one is the first Spanish wing of the Astures. The next one is the 5th cohort of Gauls. The third one, the company of bargemen from the Tigris. The fourth one to the god Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. Publius Vivelius Secundus, good Latin name, donated this altar as a gift. And then to the sacred goddess Brigantia, a Celtic goddess. Congenicus, a Celtic Roman with a Latin name, willingly and deservedly fulfilled his vow. And then finally, on Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, across from the city of London, an inscription was uncovered and subsequently an altar to the Egyptian goddess Isis. This is in London. These were not people with an army that moved out from Italy and simply conquered everybody. Do you understand? This was a cosmopolitan, complex world that existed over an area, a territory larger than the continental United States is today. It was really the whole world in the West. And this is why I said 4 lectures ago that no matter where it started out, we need to understand Rome, because by the time it comes down to us in the modern world, bears an indelible Roman stamp, and it has been strained through a Roman filter. Just look at the number of words in our language that have Latin origins. Well, Rome got too big, maybe. As I said before, the 2 greatest problems is the account of the rise of Rome, and in Western civilization, the account of the rise of Rome and the account of the fall of Rome. In some ways, the rise is a little bit easier because we can sort of cross-reference some early literature sources with inscriptions, the archaeological record. We're learning more every day. But its decline and collapse is more complex. But in some ways, I would argue, perhaps not successfully, that it's still with us. That in fact, what we are in all of what we call in the world today Western civilization is in fact this fragmented, atomized version of the Roman world that fell completely apart in the West, but it was maintained in Istanbul, maintained in the East for a very long time until it fell, till Constantinople fell in 1453. Only 40 years before Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World. Right? That's how long it lasted. Well, let me go ahead with that. Let me go back. I was going to mention something here that's not going to be on a test, but is conceptually, I think, important to understand when we come to what happens in the medieval world. The glue that held, the social glue that held the entire this entire world together was actually a system that we call the patron-client system. Patrons and clients. And it's a little difficult to understand, but there were three sort of core virtues. One had to do with sort of faithful and loyalness that a patron would have to his client. What would a patron do? Well, let's say I had a client, and that client had a daughter, and the daughter's getting married, but my client's fallen on hard times and has 6 kids at Yale and can't afford the tuition or something. I would then cover that, if I was wealthy enough. I would cover that for them, but then I would say, but I will come back to you and ask you for a favor later. You see? So who your clients were, it's a little bit like the mafia, a little bit like the scene in The Godfather, where the Godfather is sitting behind his desk and people are coming in saying, you know, Godfather, I need you to help me get my son a job with this orchestra or something over here. And the Godfather says, well, I will help with that, but I may call upon you to do a favor for me later. It's a little strange to us, and there's a sort of dark side to that, but it explains why none of the magistrates or public offices were paid, why political influence was so important and position in society was so important to them. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the extent to which you could influence the outcome of something on behalf of your clients. Well, what happens in the medieval world, in this enormous world here, is when this falls away, when the Roman state begins to fall completely, what's left is this patron-client system. And what happened in the period leading up to this, in the 4th century, is it began to get more and more sort of, for lack of a better term, loss of faith in public institutions. And more of a separation between wealth and poverty, and more of a goal of private satisfaction. Private satisfaction. Come to that later. Well, this Roman world became sort of much too unwieldy. There was a decline in the value of money, for example. And as we'll see, the Germanic tribes were being pressed up against the Rhine and the Danube. And Diocletian, who was the only emperor to actually abdicate, to resign the position, set up a system where he divided the Roman world into 2 major divisions, an eastern division and a western division, and then each of those into 2 further, what he called prefects. These were then, each of the prefects was controlled by an Augusti, and then there would be 2 emperors co-ruling. Well, this lasted for about 10 years. What happened is greed set in, and they started fighting amongst themselves. And one thing led to another, and civil war broke out again until it was ended by Constantine in about 305, 306 of the Common Era, when he defeated Maxentius north of Rome at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine then moved his capital to Turkey. This must have had an enormous impact psychologically on the Roman world. If you go back and think about the founding of all these Roman cities and all this notion that you were not part of this world until it had been inaugurated, right? And suddenly what you get is a collapse of that, and in a sense, an abandonment of the West. There were usurpers, other emperors, one in France, one in England, so forth, who claimed to be, it was a mess, ungovernable. And Diocletian attempted to reform it. Constantine brought it back for a brief period. Then it went into a steep decline. Well, Constantine moves the capital then to the city of Byzantium, and the empire we often refer to as the Byzantine Empire was really the Eastern Roman Empire, which lasted for a very long time. The wealth was in the East. He probably thought that he could preserve it by basically jettisoning the Western provinces. which were constantly giving him problems. What he built, we don't know, because Constantine's mother was a Christian. Constantine, whether he actually professed to be a Christian or not, is still debatable, but the legend is that he, of course, conquered in the sign of the cross, and thus he became actually Rome's first Christian emperor. We do know that in 312 or 313, depending upon which calendar one uses, he issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity. Christianity had been growing for a very long period of time. It was considered by going back to the 1st century, 2nd century of the Common Era, it was considered to be a sort of bizarre, weird sect of Judaism. That's what Pliny the Younger thought he was dealing with. He was the governor of Bithynia at the time of the Emperor Trajan, and we have letters that survive from that period asking what should he do about it. So there's a lot that we don't know. But at this point, it appears to me that Christianity had grown to such a degree in the Roman world that Constantine thought that he could save the empire only by legalizing it. Diocletian had tried to stamp it out. Shortly after that, it was legal, and it came up out of ground, so to speak, out of the ground, out of the shadows. So, again, what would Constantine have done when he inaugurated this city? If he was a Christian, what would he have done? There's a prohibition against that, right? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Did he put a Capitolium up there? Well, we only have one account which was written 100 years later. Nothing remains. We don't know. From a man named Zosimus. And Zosimus says that he built both, that he built churches, and he built Nymphaea, and he built a Capitolium. He sort of hybridized it all and sort of put it all in there. Well, this is not unusual if you go back to Ostia and think about the fact that within this Roman sphere, within this Roman state, there was every kind of religion known to man. Egyptian religions, Persian religions, the Lares, and so forth. And so it looks to me like Constantine probably was thinking that Christianity could operate in that same way. 100 years later, of course, it could not, and ultimately the whole West became Christian. It became the official religion, and paganism was ultimately stamped out. Pagus, by the way, means fields, rural. So, the old gods are sent into exile at some point. Rome has gone through, I think, must have gone through an incredible psychological sort of crisis. Imagine what would happen if the capital of the United States was moved from Washington, D.C. to, let's pick a place, anybody, Omaha, okay, to Omaha. What would you do with all that stuff that's in Washington? All those memorials, all those buildings, all those government buildings, the symbols of, what would Martin Luther King have done in 1963 if the Lincoln Memorial had been abandoned, and what would he have in Omaha to operate from, right? You follow me? So that's what I mean by a kind of psychological crisis. Now, what Constantine did, we don't know. We do know that the city expanded, and they're tantalizing bits and pieces of things. We know that he brought in an aqueduct. We know that underneath these were originally Christian churches. The Hagia Sophia was originally a Christian church, later converted to a mosque, and now a museum. And the original city was built here on Seraglio Point. And there are bits and pieces of the Constantinian city that remain under it, including this enormous cistern fed by an aqueduct that we see here. But we also see that the old Roman gods have now simply been used as spoils. In other words, you just take the head of Minerva and you turn it upside down to use as a column base to hold up the walls in the cistern in the water supply of the city. See that? It no longer has any currency whatsoever. There we see then this obelisk, which is constructed shortly after. I believe it was constructed by about two or three emperors later. There are a couple of these that stood in the circus, stood in the Roman circus that was there. And then the Hagia Sophia that we see here in the background. The column, similar to the column of Trajan, which is called the burnt column because it actually was pieced back together from other columns and restored by Constantine. In fact, the last public monument to be constructed in Rome was the Column of Focus, constructed around 600 as a gift by the Byzantine or Eastern Roman emperor. There he is, Constantine the Great, very funny hairstyle. And we see then the Roman world at the time that this event occurs in about 330 of the Common Era. We also notice these Germanic tribes that are pushed right up against the Rhine, where the Franks and Burgundians are, and then up against the Danube here with the Ostrogoths and the Slavs. It took me a long time to do this, but I actually mapped the disposition of the Roman legions at the time of the Emperor Constantine, beginning of his reign. You'll see where they were having trouble. It wasn't in Spain. It wasn't in France. It wasn't much in Turkey or Greece. The Persian or Parthian Empire that we see pushed up here, not so much. The problem was along the Rhine and the Danube. Now, why was that the case? Well, there had been a slow trickle of Germanic-speaking people moving into Rome for 100 years. In fact, Thomas Cahill, an author I do not particularly care for, but he wrote a book, popular series of books called The Hinges of History, one of which, his first one was called How the Irish Saved Civilization. Well, he's ethnically Irish, I guess, so it's important that his folks save civilization. It's really kind of a provocative title. What the book is really about is a contrast between two Romans, one a patrician whose name we do not know. We only know him as Saint Patrick from patrician, who was captured and taken into slavery in Ireland at the end of the Roman world in the 5th century AD. And then Ausonius, this rather vacuous Roman poet who lived in what is today Bordeaux. He had large estates, grew a lot of wine in the old Roman province of the Aquitaine. And he would have these lavish dinner parties where he would entertain all of his friends by reading them his poetry, which is really pretty bad poetry. In any event, it probably did not dawn on him when he was having these huge parties, very wealthy man, that his gardeners and the people working in the vineyards were German, or that his cooks were German, or that his servants serving the food were German, or that the people cleaning his house were German, the people shoeing his horses were German, right? He didn't know in 396 of the Common Era that in 407 the Rhine would freeze and they would come across by the millions. We'll see why they were coming across in a minute. Well, there are two reasons. One is, if we go on the Germanic side of that line, we can go into a camp and we might see them preparing a meal, boiling pieces of meat to get rid of the bacteria. People dressed in rags. They have never had a bath. Their hair is matted, filled with lice. On the other side of that line, in the Roman castrum, the officers are sitting before dinner while the chef, who probably spoke German, was actually julienning the carrots and was putting a little herbe de Provence on it with a good white wine. They are reading perhaps some lines from one of their favorite books, discussing the business of the day. The breastplates are all polished. They're hung in order on the walls. Right? Get that vivid contrast in your mind. If you were a German, where would you want to be? On the Roman side, right? For a better life for your children. Right? That was the incentive. And you can see why this was being held. Well, the other was that they were being pressured by nomads coming out of Central Asia, known as Huns, who were then creating this pressure. So they've got Rome on one side, like a barrier, like a dam, and these people migrating in on the other side, and they're being squeezed in. And when that river freezes in 407, and you can walk across it, there was no way to defend it, they simply flooded in. The Romans were never able, interestingly enough, they assimilated everybody, but they were never able to assimilate these Germanic tribes. They didn't live in cities. They didn't read and write, so on. It was, and the Roman world fell into complete disarray. The Vandals, one group, cut a swath straight down through France and Spain and occupied what is today Algeria and attacked Rome in 410 from the south. So that by between 450 and 476, in a 25-year period, the legions have been withdrawn from Britannia. They're now down to a very small area of northern France, what is today northern France, that we know as what? Brittany, because that's where the people fled. Spain and most of France is under the control of the Visigoths, who were hostile to Rome. The Ostrogoths are occupying Italy, parts of Germany, Austria, and they were friendly. So Rome itself in the west is down to Brittany and Albania along the Illyrian coast. Rome in the east continues. Rome is split then into this Western Empire and this Eastern Empire. Well, by the 7th century, the third in the triad of Abrahamic religions, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, rise up out of the Arabian Peninsula and begin to spread very rapidly into both the old Eastern Roman world and across North Africa, as well as up through the Caspian Sea into the shores of the northern part of the Black Sea. And this, interestingly enough, then creates a divide that is still with us today. We'll end here. That is still with us today, where the Mediterranean had been the glue that had held this whole world together, right, for a very long period of time, like a table with everybody sitting around it. It now becomes a dividing line between two competing religions, between Christianity on the north and Islam on the south. And unfortunately, the world is still pretty much divided that way. So it changes the whole geopolitical structure of the old Roman world, and it divides up then, collapses then into a medieval world where we will go next. Are there any questions?